It's certainly a challenge to talk about this topic, and we could come at it from a lot of different ways. And really, ultimately, what Andy asked me to do is come and visit with you today about how we might maintain some of the equity in our cow herd. And to some degree, it's almost impossible, or at least to maintain all the equity that's been built or will be built in a group of females. That is impossible to some degree. Okay, and I want to illustrate why that's the case, but some things I think we need to think about or keep in mind that will help us to maintain as much of that as possible, but also to return as much value from that equity as we can. All right, Adam, go ahead. So one of the disclaimers I want to make with this presentation is eventually if you give people a hard enough time about something, it comes back to bite you in the butt. So I give students a hard time about making a slide set on a Mac and then presenting it on a PC. This is coming back and biting me in the butt a little bit today because I made them on a PC and I'm presenting on a Mac. So, but to maintain as much quality as possible, we decided we weren't going to switch over to another computer. So you'll see some pictures that are a little out of format, maybe something being covered up. That's why. It shouldn't interfere with any of the information and what we're going to talk about. But I already mentioned this maintaining value and equity that's been created or is likely going to continue to be created over at least the short term because of our market conditions. But I really want to integrate that with some considerations for restocking and herd rebuilding. How many of you cow-calf producers? Just quick show of hands. Okay, leave your hand up if you did not have to adjust your stocking rate, you did not have to destock to some degree over the past few years. Okay, roughly 3/4 or more of the group drop their hands. Okay, so it's something that the vast majority of us have had to deal with over the past few years, and there's certainly a lot of things that play into that, a lot of considerations. I'm going to talk about some of those. I think some of the other folks that are going to present later this morning are going to talk about some others that I'm not going to spend as much time talking about. I do want to talk a little bit about the current conditions, and I want to use that as a means of setting the stage for you and some things for you to have in the back of your mind as you think about some of these or maybe some other considerations that I don't mention. All right, Adam. Okay. I think one of the first things that's important that we do is, especially with this topic, is regardless of whether we're talking about drought or not, I think for us to be as effective as possible as producers, we need to have a pretty decent understanding of the cattle cycle and the market conditions that essentially we have to deal with. Because I can make it available to anybody that wants it. Yeah, so anybody that wants this, probably the best way to do this would be reach out to Andy, and then I can make these slides available. There's nothing by any means secret in any of them. I throw that schematic up there. I'm not certain that it's perfect, but what I think it does a good job of is showing some of these competing forces, and these competing forces that are really what dictate the price that many of us will take. I think that's another important consideration, that often we are price takers. As cow-calf producers in the industry. That doesn't always have to be the case, but I think generally speaking, it does wind up being the case. But the reality is that we don't have a lot of change in demand for beef, right? I mean, yes, we maintain some demand and we slowly increase demand, but we don't see these huge swings in demand for beef like we might for some other proteins or other foods, right? So then ultimately it becomes supply that is the major driver of changes in the marketplace. Yeah, there's some other things that influence that, but if we look at just supply and various ways we can evaluate it, it explains more than 3/4 of the change in market or the variation that we see in market prices, okay? So we need to understand that as supply changes, prices are going to change. And in the beef industry, we essentially exist in roughly 8 to 12 year cycles of price going up and coming down. Okay? It has happened for a long time. I would envision that it is going to continue to happen for the foreseeable future. Probably a simpler way to look at that would be this cycle of okay, we've got an oversupply of beef relative to demand. Okay? Because of that, there's more supply than there is demand, prices go down. Okay, prices go down, we have herd reduction. Okay, now there's lots of other driving factors. For us, that's often drought, right? It's often forage or feed resources that drive that. Not always the case, but often is. Okay, that creates this undersupply of beef relative to demand that hopefully we've maintained, and that causes prices to go up. That's really the situation we exist in right now. Okay, eventually that increase in cattle price makes us want to have cows again, right? We want to participate or take advantage of some of that market that's been created by this changing, by this population change, and then that causes this whole cycle to go around again. Okay, go ahead, Adam. All right. So Andy mentioned really equity, and I'm gonna define that, at least as I see it, as value appreciation, at least in the context of the discussion that we're having today. Okay, and so this is a USDA graph that shows over the past roughly 10 years what's happened in terms of value of cattle. And this is just represented as price received for cattle. This would be across the entire United States. Different lines for all cattle, calves, cows, steers, and heifers. If you look at all those numbers on average, where we stand today, compared to that average, so what I'll call it the low part of the point in the cattle cycle, so the current cattle cycle, 2017 through 2021, cattle are generally worth somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times what they were during that time period. Okay. Now we certainly have extremes on either side of that, and I think it's typically quality, reputation, a few other things that drive which side of that we're on. Okay, and we'll talk about some of those cattle that might fall into some of those different categories in a little more detail. Okay, but I think the other thing I want to add into this is you look where we're currently at. We're still on the uphill swing of this, and at least those that spend a lot more time studying economics than I do in College Station, their current prediction is that we're going to continue in this upward trend probably over the better part of the next somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 2 years. I think the current call is that's likely going to be somewhere in the vicinity of about a year to a year and a half. Okay, so I interpret that to mean, okay, cattle are going to continue to appreciate in value over the next year to year and a half, and then what happens when that stops? They're probably not going to stay there all that long. They might stay there for some period of time, but just like everything else, gravity pulls on the market, right? What goes up is eventually going to come back down. So I also interpret that to mean that we're probably somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 3 years from being on the downhill slope of market conditions. Okay, I think that's something that's incredibly important to consider, and that Andy already alluded to this morning, is that we're talking about investing to some degree. Most of us are, if we've had to destock. We're talking about investing in what is going to potentially be an incredibly expensive asset. Okay, go ahead, Adam. Other thing I think that plays into this, I'm going to show you a series of pictures here, and not by any means perfect examples, but they're ones that I'm going to use to illustrate a couple points. And this is our current grassland productivity forecast for the Panhandle for this current growing season, which at least how it's utilized by this tool, we're at the end of. Okay, that blue indicates that we essentially would expect to have experienced above average forage growth during this growing season. Okay, how many of you would say that reflects the conditions on your ranch? That's been my observation throughout the Panhandle, is most of these numbers are probably pretty close. Okay, somewhere in the vicinity of 5 to 30% or more than normal forage growth this growing season. We received some timely rainfall. Yes, ma'am.
Could you repeat that? That's a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
Website.
Yeah. So that website is grasscast, okay, spelled like it sounds, .unl, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, .edu. Okay, that's where this is housed. There's other versions of this tool or similar tools that are available. I'm using this to illustrate the point, but I do think it's something for us to have on our radar and look at in the future, especially from a prediction standpoint. That's one of the reasons why I put this in front of you is I'm showing you one of these maps. Okay, this tool will actually provide you 3. And those are model predictions based upon whether we receive one of 3 scenarios: below normal, normal, or above normal rainfall throughout the remainder of the growing season. Okay, and Tim's probably going to ask the question, what the heck does normal rainfall mean, right? And we know there's a lot of variation there. But thus far, as I've evaluated this, it's done a pretty decent job of painting the picture of the average forage conditions, at least that I've seen. Okay, but I'm using this to illustrate the point that most of us are probably in a lot better forage position than we were this time a few years ago. Okay, go ahead, Adam. All right. Nationwide and state drought conditions. Okay, again, absolutely an imperfect tool, but one that I think tells a pretty decent high-level view of drought conditions. Okay, you look at where we are in the state, arguably we're as good here in terms of deviation from normal precipitation, which is really how this is calculated, relative to a lot of other parts of the state. Now, a year and a half ago, absolutely not the case, right? I really wanted to use this to show that if you aren't aware, there's lots of other parts of the state that are in pretty tough shape. And there are parts of the state that get into tough shape a lot faster than we do because they're used to more frequent rainfall. Okay? There's potentially going to be a lot of cattle moving from that part of the state in the not too distant future because they didn't make very much hay this year either. And maybe opportunities, risks associated with those opportunities that I want to talk about as well. Yeah.
Area too, that's the darkest red and red is where the majority of the mothered cows reside in the state of Texas.
There's a lot of cattle in that part of the state. And having been there about a month ago and seeing, yeah, they're pretty tough shape. Those that are there that I talked to last week say they essentially haven't gotten any rain since then.
I was there last week.
Yeah.
It's worse than worse.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of people, and I don't want to say, worse comparatively, but what they've told me is they're 2011 and worse conditions in a lot of those places. Okay, so it's a real deal there, and it was a real deal for us not that long ago. Okay, Adam. Okay, I'm not a meteorologist, and certainly don't want to pretend to be one, but the reality is I think it's important that we have some idea of what we might be looking to in the future to plan around and make decisions based upon. Okay. The resource that I use for that would be our NOAA long-term forecast. I'm going to show you 2 of those, one for October through December. So what I'm going to consider our cool season annual forage growth, really, where we're gonna hopefully get some wheat pasture out of that precipitation. The next one that I'll show you is next summer's native perennial, predominantly warm season grass pasture. But the point I want to make is, we've heard a lot of talk about El Nino and conditions getting a lot better. Well, the current long-term NOAA forecasts say to expect near normal precipitation. Okay. Over the coming fall and winter months, expect near normal precipitation, near normal temperatures. Okay? All right. Go ahead to the next slide, Adam. If we look into the next growing season, and that's a long ways off, so there's not a lot of difference here. There's not a lot of confidence, I think, in these projections. But we look at May through July. Again, the current forecast is near normal conditions. So a lot better than what we would have faced the past couple years, but not by any means. I don't know that we should be expecting to have over 100% of normal average forage growth for the coming years, at least not based on the current conditions. All right, so moving forward and thinking about how we might try to maintain some equity in a cow herd, I think one of the first things I want to encourage you to do is if we do find ourselves in a lot better forage growing conditions moving forward, don't forget where we came from. Okay? We do have a lot of opportunity if we destocked to make some changes in a cow herd, and I want to talk about those, but I encourage you to use the recent experiences as an educational tool. What did we learn from that? Can we use that as an opportunity to flip the paradigm, so to speak? So if we're in a situation where we're managing for the best conditions and reacting to the worst, what if we flip that? We manage for the expectation of the worst, and then we react, we adjust to those improving conditions. Same about speed at which we do that. How quickly are we reacting to changing conditions? All right. Often we're really slow to react to deteriorating or declining conditions, but really quick to respond to improving conditions. I'm risk averse, and most of the recommendations I make reflect that. If we want to be risk averse or take a risk averse approach to this, that's probably at least some of the mentality that we need to have moving forward. Okay. Now getting back to some of the initial points that Andy made, and I think are really important for us to consider moving forward in the market conditions, are that a lot of us are going to be faced with decisions around restocking during strong market conditions, right? That may, and I use the word may strongly, allow us to participate in some high feeder cattle markets over the short term. But if we aren't careful, what it really requires us to do is to bear the cost of potentially expensive replacements over the long term. Okay? So back to that point that Andy mentioned, a lot of people still may be trying to pay off some cows now that they overspent for once upon a time. We are facing that same decision today, and we will be facing that same decision over the coming months and maybe year or two. Okay, so I'm a believer that the high point in the cattle market is absolutely not an ideal time to invest in replacements. And if we are going to invest in them, we need to be very careful. We need to be very judicious about how we do that. Okay, so you might interpret that to mean don't rebuild the herd. Don't retain some replacements. That's not what I'm saying. My wife and daughter and I are probably going to buy some replacement heifers and use those as a foundation, as a nucleus to build a herd. I think we have to be very careful about the decisions we make doing that, because we have such a high risk of overpaying for cattle that may not return their investment in the long term. Okay, so that some might interpret that to mean, okay, buy cheap cattle, right? That's one option. That might be one strategy that works. The thing we have to consider when we're doing that is, if we're in a situation where we have grass and everybody else has grass, if they're being sold and we're coming and they're local cattle, why are they being sold? Okay? If they're being culled, there's probably a reason why they're being culled. That does not mean there aren't good replacement cattle to be found that are being sold. It just means we have to be very careful and dig in to try to be very, very selective about which ones we pick, because we might wind up inheriting some other people's problems if we aren't careful. Okay, and culls may not be a solid foundation upon which to build a long-term cow herd unless we're going to be very pointed, very committed and strategic about upgrading those females. Okay, and I think Isaac's family is doing that as we talk, and I think you're going to see some of those cattle. Okay, so we think specifically about maintaining equity. So trying to ensure some of that value in cattle that have been created through an upswing in the market over the long term. I think it's important that we consider a few very specific things. Okay, it's important that we do focus, if we want to have this herd that we can potentially keep, potentially when everyone else is selling cattle. For me, it's pretty important that those are fairly low overhead type cattle. Okay, so they have to be cattle that don't require an incredibly large amount of input for us to be able to maintain. Okay? Or maybe it's a situation where we have more females producing calves that are going to be sold under more favorable market conditions, right? That's ultimately one of the ways we might be able to maintain some of that equity, okay, is that we're able to hang on to them and they're still productive even once the market has dropped off, okay? These things are only going to work if we're able to keep those cattle when our neighbors are selling them, okay? And hopefully when the market drops again, I'm not saying I hope that it does, but ultimately it's going to, and when it does, hopefully it's not drought induced for us, right? Hopefully we're able to still take advantage of some of the market that exists, okay? So one of the things that might allow us to do that is increasing our resiliency to drought, okay? You're going to hear I think from a grazing and a forage management standpoint, you're going to hear a lot about some of the things that we can do later on today. I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about that. I'm going to talk more on the cattle management side as we finish up my time slot. Okay, but also I think one of the things that all of us should have in the back of our minds and consider is the marketing component to this. Is depending upon how we market cattle, that could dictate the difference between profit and loss for a lot of us, especially as we move from high to lower marketing conditions. So I'd encourage you to market cattle in a way that's going to allow you to realize as much value in them as possible. All right, Adam? All right. The other thing I want to mention before talking about some specifics is that if we have destocked and we're looking at restocking, there's a substantial opportunity for us to go ahead and grasp, to start to utilize some what I'm going to call core or gateway management practices that we may not already have, okay? So if we want to be really strategic in the future, when we are in our next drought, because reality is going to happen, right? All right, and we want to be strategic about which ones stay and which ones go. Or if we're looking at repopulating the cow herd, and we want to make sure we're repopulating it with those that are likely to be the most productive under the least input, so trying to find that optimal animal for the operation, I think there's a couple things we need to have in place that allow us to take advantage of that. For me, first and foremost, I need to know who they are if I want to be able to make a decision at the individual animal level, okay? Doesn't mean I can't make decisions without that, but I'm very limited in what really local at the individual animal-to-animal level, what decisions I can make on an animal if I don't know who they are and I don't know what they've done for the operation. I'm not a proponent of keeping records just for record-keeping sake. Okay? But think about what are those records that are going to empower you to make more strategic decisions, whether that's retain and replacement heifers or that's deciding which ones no longer have a spot on the operation. Okay. As we do that, I'd also encourage you to find how well your actual production calendar pairs with your forage resources. Okay, so if you're in a situation where you've completely destocked, you're far fewer cows than you would normally be, take a critical, hard look at your supplementation requirements. And I just throw up two examples there, and these are a bit oversimplifications, okay, but I see this time and time again in the real world. We've got two scenarios. The left-hand side, we've got a cow herd that's calving in synchrony with their forage resources, and on the right-hand side, a cow herd that's not. For whatever reason, we wanted calves born then because that's what the neighbors did. That's when we would fit our market, whatever it might be. But if you look at the blue portion of that graph, in that same cow herd, there's very, very different supplementation requirements if we're going to meet their needs. And I'm just using protein as an example here. If you look at those months, I'm not saying everybody should be calving in May. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm suggesting is take a hard look at when you're calving relative to your forage resources. Okay, when they're able to provide the most nutrients to your cattle. That's going to give you a pretty good idea of when you need to be calving if you want to pair that time with when you're trying to get cows bred back. Okay. If you currently exist in a year-round calving season and want to move to a defined calving season, which I would certainly encourage, look at when the bulk of those cows are calving. There's a reason why they've gravitated to that point. Okay, that'll give you a pretty good idea of what your forage resources will support. Hopefully, you've peeled off the backside of that as you had to destock some cows. Okay, we got lots of options that we're facing if we're looking at restocking. Okay, so purchasing cows, whether those are breds or opens, purchasing bred heifers or open heifer calves, and then retaining home-raised replacement heifers. I would venture to say for most of us, there's going to be some combination of retaining some home-raised replacement heifers and then buying something else. Okay, all right, go ahead, Adam. We'll stay here just for a second, Adam. I want to talk about each of these questions. On the next slide, I'm going to have a table where I've just listed what I think some potential risks and benefits are for each of those options. I'm not going to say it's all encompassing, but it encompasses what some of my experiences have been. Regardless of which of those options we're going to go with, I think there's a couple key questions that are important to consider. First and foremost, if we have some degree of a herd left and we're looking at bringing other cattle into that herd, my primary concern above what they look like, genetics, anything else, is what risk do they potentially pose to the remainder of that herd. This is a critically important consideration, especially as we look at cattle potentially moving from east and central Texas to here. I'm very concerned about anaplasmosis, because if we take a naive herd and introduce anaplasmosis into that herd, whether it's through not changing needles or it's through ticks or flies or whatever, insert your preferred means of blood transfer from cow to cow, that can smoke a cow herd in no time if it's a naive herd. Okay, so that's something we need to be very concerned about. Trichomoniasis would be another example. Certainly, yeah, the cows will clear over time, but if we have then taken our bull and exposed and infected him, and this creates a pretty nasty cycle. So there's some risks there, right? Anaplas, though, is the first on my mind, especially where cattle are likely going to move from and to. I've already alluded to this one. Why are they being sold? Doesn't mean there aren't good ones being sold, but certainly, you know, I'm going to raise an eyebrow at them, and I'm going to think about them really hard. How similarly were they managed, and in how similar of an environment were they managed to the one that you're going to expect them to go to work for you in? It does not mean we can't take cattle out of different environments and make them work, but it increases the risk of a production failure. Okay? And if we're not going to do what we need to, and most of the time it's too expensive to feed them enough to make them remain productive in that environment, that represents a substantial risk. They fall out of the herd. Now we've got expensive cattle that we're still trying to pay off once they're no longer there. Okay? And then lastly, but certainly not least, are they going to help take your herd in the direction you want it to go? If that direction is, I want to have some cows, there's a lot less criteria than that. Than I want to take these cows from where they currently are and optimize them to my environment. Make them as productive as possible with the fewest amount of resources. Okay, that may look like different things in different operations. Okay, I've just got a few of those that I put up there. I'm not going to talk about all the major advantages and disadvantages, but I do want to talk about some of those, at least as I see them. You know, and I'm referring to bred cows as either seed stock or sale barn, and that's an imperfect way to do that, right? There's a lot of good seed stock type cattle that are marketed by a sale barn or marketed by some marketing agency. Interpret that to mean high quality and lower quality or cull type cows. That's really what we're getting at with that. You look at the advantage of these higher quality, upper end seed stock type cows are genetics, but we're also going to pay for those genetics. Okay, and that may present a challenge for a lot of us in the current market. That is going to decline over the not too distant future. Okay, those cattle, as another advantage though, do tend to have lower health and production risks because of how they've been managed, because of the operations they're coming out of. They do have a greater risk of potentially not being matched to our environment though. Okay, bred heifers, probably the option that most I would guess are gonna pick. I think the major advantage there is longevity out of those. Once we get over those that aren't gonna breed back. Okay, that's something we need to consider, is there's a certain percentage of those that aren't going to work. I mean, which ones are our problem females when it comes to preg check time? There are young cows, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, right? Those are ones we're talking about buying, so we need to be conscious that there's going to be some fallout in those. Okay, those lower quality bred sale barn cows, I don't know where we're at in the current market. I hate to admit it, but they may be one of the better options for some of us. I'm going to encourage you, if you go that route, a couple things that are important to keep in mind. One is unless you want them to remain those low quality cattle over time, we need to upgrade them. And we upgrade them through sire selection. I'll talk about that. Okay? They may not have as much longevity in them as some of the other options, right? They probably came up open and got bred back if they're bred, and so they may calve once or twice before they have the risk of coming up open again. Probably the biggest advantage to them, I think, in our current situation is that if they're bred, and as long as they don't slip that calf, they're at least returning a portion of their investment in the not too distant future, and hopefully soon enough to where we can take advantage of some of the strong market. Okay, open cows, those are my personal preference, are going to be absolute bottom of the list, because there's a reason why those cows are open when they shouldn't be. They're certainly almost always going to be the cheapest, and there's certainly almost always availability to them, but I'm concerned about longevity, and I'm very concerned about health risk that those cattle pose to the others. Okay, and then a little bit's getting cut off at the bottom with open heifer calves. I think the advantages they offer is you got a lot of options. You have genetic flexibility with some of the decisions that still remain to be made with those cattle. Cost is an advantage of them. Pretty long time to return an investment with those females, right? And so if we look at buying open heifer calves that are being weaned over the next couple months, when is she gonna potentially, we're gonna market some of those hopefully that don't get bred early on. But if we look at those that are going to be productive, how long is it until we've got a calf to sell out of her? Yeah, we've got every bit of 2 years until we're marketing a calf out of her. And I think that is potentially risky in the current market. The thing to consider, though, is that we can still take advantage of some of the upward movement that remains in a downward moving market, if that makes sense. Some of that additional value that's been created. All right, Adam. Okay. Most of us, I think, though, are going to at least do some replacement heifer selection as a means of rebuilding the cow herd. And so I know a number of you have probably seen this in various forms at various places that I presented it. But this is something that I truly, truly believe in. I think we need to build the herd using heifers that are likely going to do what we want them to do. Okay, so first and foremost for me, they need to perform at an acceptable level as a calf. If we got issues with health, don't retain heifers that had health problems. Okay, let's put genetic selection on traits that are relevant to us. Okay, so heifers that didn't need to be treated for scours or BRDs, probably going to cover most of them. They need to begin cycling at the beginning of the breeding season if we want them to get pregnant at the beginning and then calve at the beginning of the calving season. Okay? They need to calve by their second birthday and hopefully do it without any problems. Okay? And I encourage you to go back to that concept of identification and record keeping. Is if mama's pretty good, well, in theory, if we're doing our due diligence with sire selection, baby ought to be a little better. Okay? But we know if that cow was pretty good, that at least gives us some indication that that female is going to have a high likelihood of being better than average in the group. Okay, if I want to simplify that, okay, if that's too complicated, or we don't want to think about it that hard, if I'm going to pick a couple criteria that I think are most important, going to be most likely to wind up selecting replacement heifers that are going to have a shot at maintaining as much equity as possible. First and foremost, how old is she in the group? If I'm going to pick a heifer based on one thing, I'm picking it based on her age, because that tells me mama was able to get bred and calve earlier or towards the top of what the group did. How early did she conceive? So how early was she born, and then was she able to do that for you on the operation? Then from there, is she on a don't keep cows out of, or heifers out of these cows or these bulls list? I think we should all probably have that list, okay? And then has she given you any reason to change your career path? There's a couple of those, we get them up and work them for the first time. It says, yeah, I thought I was going to keep her. I don't think I'm going to, right? All right, so I think if we want to simplify that list, these are the important things that are on it for me. Continue to maintain those high expectations for cows, okay? Make them continue to be productive in your environment, okay? Take advantage of replacing or moving those that aren't. Take advantage of the value that's been created in those. Use those to put into some other potential investment. Okay, I mentioned the sire and its importance. Okay, I don't think we do a good enough job of emphasizing how important of a role the bull plays in genetic merit in a cow herd where we have made change through replacement heifers and retaining those from our herd. Now, if we're buying replacement heifers, well, the bull's responsible for 50% of that calf's genetics. But if we look at the generational change, and that's an oversimplification, there's a little bit of change associated with mitochondrial migration of DNA, so the numbers are a little less than what's reflected across those generations. But by and large, once we get to the 5th generation, nearly all of the genetics in that female are a consequence of our bull decisions. Okay? So the bull is the means through which we make major change. There's a lot of tools, a lot of things we have at our fingertips, EPDs, value indices, actual phenotype. I'm a proponent of all of these things to some degree, and not any single one of them. I'll also leave that disclaimer. But we have a lot of tools available to make those decisions. I'd encourage you, if I leave you with one piece of advice in sire selection, it is look beyond one trait. Okay, avoid single trait selection, because we know that if we only focus on output traits like weaning weight, we're going to make bigger cows. If we only focus on birth weight, we know there's going to be performance and potentially health implications. There are relationships between traits. Okay, and so when we look at only one trait, we potentially bring some undesirable traits along for the ride. And so I'd encourage you to focus on the big picture when we're making these decisions. And there's some indices that have been developed to try to help us do that. Okay, so one strategy that I think might work for a lot of us, if the concerns among where we are in the cattle cycle and where calf value is potentially going, and we're concerned about overpaying for replacement females that might take a long time to return their investment, I'd encourage you to slowly rebuild your herd as forages allow, but I'd also encourage you to be very, very strategic about those that you do retain, because they're going to have to do more than just make commercial calf returns. Okay? Be critical when you select them. If the opportunity presents itself and forages allow, one option that might work for a lot would be to retain, and we talked about this, I think, at this time last year. Retain some heifers, but then sell every single one of them as breds that you don't need for your operation. That's going to allow you to probably take advantage of as much upward movement in the market as exists. All right? The other, if you're not interested in doing that, you're not interested in rebuilding right now, use those forages to add as much value to your current calf crop as you can. So if you haven't weaned and preconditioned calves, this might be an opportunity to utilize some of those forages to do so. I'd encourage you to extend that out to 60 days or more if you have the opportunity. We need to be mindful of forage availability and forage quality. We need to be mindful of cost versus value of gain in doing that, as well as some market seasonality. But I encourage you to take advantage of those forages in that way if that's going to be the best option for you. And then one of the last things I want to mention is reality is most of us have fewer pounds to sell this year. Those pounds are worth a lot more than they have been over the recent past. So I'd encourage you to think about what things we can do to add as much additional value to those calves as possible. I think implants, although they're often not promoted as such by some marketing groups, when we've actually gone through the return on investment numbers using implants at the cow-calf and weaned calf, so suckling calf and weaned calf level, huge potential return on investment, even if we're compared to marketing cattle through some NHTC and natural programs, once we account for enrollment cost and the opportunity cost of not using the implant. Ionophores, if you're not already using them, I'd encourage you to consider them if your marketing program will allow it. We could spend, and we're going to here in about a month with a webinar. Andy can put you in touch with some of that information. But if you look at the ionophore, what it does from a potential calf growth standpoint because of efficiency, forage intake reduction on the cow herd. Okay, there's huge potential for return on investment from an ionophore that costs at cow dose levels 2 to 3 cents per head per day. We're looking at about a 10% forage intake reduction and maintenance of previous level of productivity. So a lot of opportunity to do so there. I'd encourage you to take advantage of the opportunities that you have that have been created by a strong market. I want to encourage you to also be very cautious about being too optimistic about how long you're going to be able to participate in that market. Build a strong foundation and expand it as forages and resources allow, but I want to encourage you not to put yourself in a bind for years to come. Add as much value as possible and focus on making that cow herd as drought resilient as possible so that it's in a better position to handle the next one whenever it comes around. With that, I appreciate the time and the opportunity to be here. Anybody that wants slides, has questions after this, I don't know what we're going to have time for, let Andy know. He knows how to get a hold of me. My contact information's there as well, but he'd be the best way to get a hold of me. Thank you, Andy. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Let's give Dr. Smith a big round of applause.